Okay, on the show today, Alexander Bard. So Wikipedia describes him as all kinds of things. I know him as a philosopher, really, but also a kind of philosopher activist involved with politics. And, he's been on TV a lot in Sweden. Public intellectual would be one term for him. Absolutely fascinating and sometimes controversial guy that I once met in Stockholm. And for about a year, I've been trying to get him back on the show. So, Alexander, welcome.
It's an honor to be here.
Where are you in the world today, sir?
I'm in Stockholm, in Sweden today, actually. Excellent. So I decided to stay here in Sweden for the Corona months. I'm like you, I travel all the time. We both love traveling, right? But this is my first year in 30 years where I actually spend the winter in Scandinavia, where I normally live. Because I'm one of these guys who will always get a villa in Bali or something for the winter and take my friends with me, and I would go to the tropics and enjoy it. But it's very exciting to actually experience the sort of dark, cold winters you have in Scandinavia.
I was in Norway in December, and I've been in Finland in January, northern Finland, and it's significantly different from the UK or Germany, for example. Like, there's a depth and darkness to it, which is significantly different.
Yeah, there is. Proper winter, yes.
Proper fucking winter. Let's hear about your life story then, sir. Like, how did you become a philosopher? It's not really a job that you apply for normally. So what's your story, how you got involved in this?
Well, I grew up in a mixed South African Scandinavian family. So we were bicultural, which I think is an advantage for anybody these days. I mean, if you're lucky enough to speak at least 2 languages from birth and, have several different cultural backgrounds, it gives you more freedom automatically. So I was, fostered to be free. We got out of apartheid in South Africa, arrived in Scandinavia, and had a mixed race family. So it's just like, do what you want, pursue your own things in life. And as a boy, actually, this is true, but actually when I was 7 years old, I had this big room to myself. My sister was next door, and I would have half the room decorated with rock stars, and the other half of the room decorated by philosophers. They were all men, and they all had beards. This was before transsexuality. And
now you're a rock star philosopher with a beard.
I became a rock star, and after that, I became a philosopher. So, I was 7 years old. It's pretty much set in stone where I would arrive if I got the opportunity. And I was lucky enough. They had enough talent, had the right connections, the right mentors, everything. So I pursued a career in the music industry for 25 years. But I've been professional now for the last 7 or 8 years. I've been a philosopher full time.
And the rockstar thing, just for listeners, that's not a metaphor, right? Scandinavia has its own sort of bands that can be incredibly popular and well known there that people may not know outside of there.
Well, you're from the UK, so that means the music industry has been American, British, and Scandinavian for the past 30 years. The Scandinavians are slightly more discreet about it. They're the Japanese of the music industry. I mean, we got guys like Max Martin, who's a neighbor of mine in Stockholm. He is the biggest record producer, songwriter ever. He's had more #1 records in America than all of the Brits combined, more or less.
Wow.
So I was part of that industry, and I wrote hit songs. So the last song I wrote before I quit was actually the winning song on the TV show The Voice in China. So
wow, in China.
Yeah, that was a good way to go, right? So I was a songwriter throughout. I was also a record producer. I ran my own record companies. I had 4 bands, and I was fortunate enough to tour the world. So having seen the world from that perspective is fantastic.
And why did you quit? Like, what made you go, this isn't the industry for me, and made you sort of lean into the philosophy more?
Okay, so it takes tons of energy to be a really good songwriter and music producer. And I was lucky enough or smart enough to actually develop my career as a writer and a philosopher in parallel. So if I started the music in the mid-1980s, by 1998, I sold my first record company and had fuck off money for the first time in my life. I love the term fuck off money because
I love
it means, it means you made enough money to take care of yourself and those you love, but you can then say no to anything you don't want. You can say yes to everything you love. And that's the whole point of making money. Making money beyond that is useless. But if you have enough money to have that kind of freedom, that's fantastic. So I did that in 1998. And the first thing I did was that I started working at the Stockholm School of Economics, which is why I ended up in Stockholm. And I started running a digital studies department, essentially, for executive education. This is like, say, if you do management in an organization, corporation, and you're like, you got the last level to kick in before you become a boss. These are the kind of educations you would then attend. And my specialty was digital because I came from the music industry and I was an academic and I loved the internet and its enormous potential. So that led to the first book. that I co-wrote with John, my very loyal co-writer, that was published in the year 2000, called The Netocrats. And 4 books into that process, we came to a point, which was 8 years ago, where I realized I'm getting a little older now, meaning that I've got a lot of wisdom. I've learned a lot of things, but the energy isn't really there to maintain 2 careers successfully. And rather than being mediocre at both, I decided that, no, that's enough with music. I've done it. There are 18 million songs on Spotify. The world doesn't need another song from me, but actually it needs more philosophy on the age we live in. And that's when I decided to pursue philosophy full-time.
Okay, and you're associated with, is it Synthesism? Am I saying that right?
Synthesism, right. So one of the books I've written with John Söderqvist. Okay, it's called Synthesism, Creating God in the Internet Age. And it's at first a sort of easy little wordplay when you know these aggressive atheists we have around these days, especially from Britain. They say that God must not exist or whatever. They can't find enough gods to kill because there are loads of gods to kill if you want to be an atheist. It's a very unthankful task, right?
But you come to
yeah. Well, the Scandinavians just stopped going to church because they were lazy. That's why they became atheists. They were pagan all along, and they still are. But anyway, so the idea that atheism is somehow the end of history is kind of a boring idea. I mean, if the word God exists, and the word itself is a name we put on the ultimate things, like the ultimate horizon. From the past, it's always God. Where we go, it's always God. So we wrote in this book, Synthesism, Creating God in the Internet Age. We said that, wait a second, what if God did not create us? What if that wasn't necessary? What if we just put God in the wrong place? God is really the name for where we're going. You see, over the last 10,000 years that we call civilization, religion and spirituality has gone downhill, gotten a lot worse, and technology has gone uphill. And you could even start arguing by now that it seems like technology has hijacked us humans, so technology can develop itself into something that technology wants to be. Now, another word for that would be God. So maybe the whole point was that technology ultimately is God. And then whether it's a good God or a bad God, that's what we need to decide now, and very quickly so. So it's like a theological approach to, for example, climate change, to say, the fact that nuclear weapons are widespread. We have world pandemics these days to deal with. All these problems we need to deal with now that are existential to us are actually better addressed through theology than in any other method. And then we would argue in the book that instead of thinking of religion as a world of magic, like religion of magic, we need to replace that with religion of technology. Religion and technology always have been tied together, because religion is how we contain ourselves, how we behave, how we maintain a sustainable lifestyle rather than just throw ourselves off the cliff.
I'm just trying to spell Synthesism. So what do you think of this idea of the God-shaped hole? That I can't keep coming across that the idea that we tried to get kind of rid of religion, rid of spirituality, and then it just reemerges. Like people take up yoga, or people make their politics, their social justice kind of almost like it has a religious quality to it. Or, in America, it becomes a sort of state religion of, singing to the flag, the state becomes the religion. It's almost like humans have this urge for something religious. Consumerism the celebrity becomes a religion. It seems like we are religious creatures, and if we don't constantly put that somewhere.
It's the opening sentence of the Synthesism book. The first sentence is, everything is religion, and if it pretends to be anything but religion, that's when it gets dangerous. It's always when I have an aggressive atheist come up to me, and I said, I'm not a theist, I'm not an atheist, I'm a synthist. Serve the word God for what is to come. You have no other name for it. Okay, they can't argue against that. They were prepared for that, were they? And then I just tell them that we have practiced atheism on a massive scale for about 100 years. And Hitler and Stalin were both atheists. It's not like you were in a good club, It's just like that didn't work. And I think one of the reasons it didn't work was that religion and spirituality are absolutely essential to what it means to be human.
And it comes out, doesn't it? Like, I really, for example, I have some friends that are really into politics, and they talk about almost like saved and not saved groups. It has an evangelical quality to it. And the special saved group who know the special saved words and of the special rituals they've gone through. And it just sounds, as someone who grew up with Catholicism, it's just like, wow, this is so religious. But they would never see it that way. They're just acting in a religious type way.
Yeah, and they're tribal. Okay, so the idea here is that our group is better than your group, we're superior to you, whatever. I'm pretty disgusted with any of those ideas. I think we're all human. But what I mean with that radically is that the religions I am interested in, the ones that I study the most, are the ones that don't have missionaries at all. Because if a religion really seeks the truth, it's not going to go and knock you on your head and say you're wrong all day long. It's going to be adamant that you're probably going to find the truth anyway, if that is your serious disposition. And I loved Buddhism, for example, started there. I went to Asia already in the 1980s. I discovered Taoism and Zoroastrianism. I eventually converted to Zoroastrianism, which is the third one of the three.
No one talks about that. No one talks about that.
No, but they will. They probably will, because they discovered Buddhism first in the West. That was like 40 years ago. And Taoism became popular like, 20, 30 years ago. And now people are discovering Zoroastrianism. It just turns out that these three religions were all one and the same, because they were the different schools of thought along the Silk Route. And I'm much more interested in spirituality that's practiced along a trade route than I'm interested in any form of spirituality that is dictated from above in a centralized empire or something like that. Yeah. Which is the way Christianity and Islam were presented to us. I think that your own serious personal journey is the one that's important. And how do you go back to something tribal? How do you go back to something tribal that works? That isn't about you being superior to others, but rather about how do you maintain and how do you get a certain pride in your own tribe that you belong to, so you can skip both individualism and collectivism, which I think are two poisons to humanity.
Well, I definitely want to talk about that, particularly in a Swedish context. But just to complete a little bit there, Zoroastrianism, you're probably the only speaker we've had on the show, and I know you are, who's even mentioned that term. So just can you give people a little bit of a sense of it, if they're just curious, like what the hell it is?
You will discover, because there are a lot of Iranians who immigrated from Iran since the 1970s, and the new young generation of Iranian Americans and Iranian Europeans will talk a lot about Zoroastrianism. Okay. This is part of the Persian heritage, the same way that Taoism is quintessential for Chinese heritage, or Buddhism is quintessential for Indian heritage. But actually these isms are like labels we Europeans have put on Asian thinking. So if you look at the Silk Route and the different trading posts, you would basically go to a new oasis somewhere along the trade route, and you would trade your stuff, and then you try to go on to the next one. And you would go through these different places. There'd be like a hospice where you would stay. There'd be like a small restaurant, you eat your food. There'd be a bathhouse where you go and clean yourself. There'd probably be a whorehouse along the way as well, or some kind of entertainment. And eventually you would arrive at what was called a kostag. And the kostags that the Persians built were the origins of what we call cloisters in Latin, and later called, of course, monasteries. So these were like spiritual places you would go to isolate yourself and cleanse your soul rather than your body before you would go on to the next stop. So it's just like, can I just get all the bad trade deals I made out of the system and get the good deals into my mind, so I become more constructive and positive thinking before I go to the next trade post? These are the original schools of thought you have along the trade routes, and this is the original form of organized religion, as long as it is decentralized. That's how it works. And those are the kind of things I'm interested in. Then it's more like a matter of choice. If you study Eastern philosophy, so do you want to immerse yourself more in Buddhism, Taoism, or Zoroastrianism? And it only makes sense to eventually convert to one of the three to practice all three.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So my background's been mostly in Buddhism with some Taoist influence, and obviously I like Freddie Mercury, so Zoroastrian, he was from a Zoroastrian family as far as I can tell, so it only has an entirely good connotation for me so far.
His name was actually Farrokh Bulsara. So the first time I hanged out with Zoroastrians in London, and these were Parsis from India. They're a small group of people from India who are incredibly successful at everything they do. They more or less own half of India, right? So the Parsis had a dinner in London. I was invited because I was scholar of the religion, and I'd also converted. And I asked about Freddie Mercury, and they didn't know what I was talking about. All I know, Freddie had lived most of his life in London. He lived in Munich partly. He was born in Tanzania, but he was a Parsi. And we're sitting there talking, and then suddenly one of the older gentlemen just said, "Oh, Freddie Mercury, you mean Farrokh Bulsara, the son from the Bulsara family?" And they said, and everybody said, "Oh, him. Yeah, he donated half his fortune to our community. So we're like wealthy, like forever because of him." So it turned out that they all knew who Freddie Mercury was, certainly so.
There we go. Okay, so you talked about individualism, collectivism. This is, people might not know some of the terminology, but this is behind a lot of what's going on right now in the world. is almost this war between, do we identify as our social groups? Do we identify as an individual? Also within the Scandinavian context, I saw a video, I think it was from one of the Scandinavian airlines, saying nothing is truly Scandinavian. There's no such thing as Scandinavia. And he's saying
we hated that ad. It's like spitting on yourself.
I thought you might. There's a sort of self-hatred in Scandinavia I've come across.
It's a fashion at the moment. But reality is that Scandinavians think they're superior to others, especially when it comes to ideas, which I also think is ridiculous. Okay. They're dealing with, Scandinavia today is a part of the world is very successful, but it's full of nouveau rich middle-class people.
Yes.
You don't have an old upper class that has traditions and distinctions and things like that. And you don't have an underclass that are completely obsessed with struggling with the upper class. You basically have a culture that's entirely middle class,
right?
All nouveau rich, and they're into fashions. There's a reason why H&M and IKEA come out of Sweden. Like, this is a fashion obsessed country, but they even think of ideas as fashions, which I learned when I was a kid. My dad told me that. You have to remember that the Swedes, they change opinions as often as they change underwear. It doesn't mean that much, and you can actually use it to your own advantage. Just don't take their opinions too seriously, because they don't themselves. They don't even understand what it means to have a fundamental opinion, be grounded in an opinion at all, because they change their opinions all the time, and they're also very conformist. And that's something I discovered with Scandinavia.
Very conformist. I found that. I found shockingly so.
Yes. Yeah. Which, for good or bad, is fascinating. Yeah. But it can also be very boring. So it's one of the things you got to live with if you decide to live in Scandinavia. It's like, okay, you got to fight this conformism constantly. But on the other hand, you can change people's minds in this part of the world. And that's partly what I try to do in my work.
It's almost sometimes Scandinavia is presented as this sort of socialist utopia where everything works really well and everything's fair and everybody has healthcare. Like, a lot of Americans, for example, would point to Denmark or Sweden or Finland as sort of how things should be in the whole world. And I've become a little bit skeptical of that idea.
Yeah, it's kind of boring that it's all nouveau rich middle class, because that's why it's so conformist. It is the fact that people do come from very similar backgrounds, and they were all urbanized simultaneously. There are small differences between the different countries, and they try to highlight those as well. They certainly handled COVID-19 very differently in these four countries. But for Scandinavians, it means I can leave Stockholm, move to Copenhagen or Oslo if I prefer the differences there. But, maybe Britain will end up something similar, that Scotland will go its own way and Ireland will be united. But at the end of the day, they'll be very similar, just like Scandinavia anyway.
And the other thing, I'd love to get your sort of philosophical opinion on this as a religious scholar. So for those watching on the YouTube, they can see Alexander looks like a biker Viking, big beard, no hair, jovially chop your head off with an axe is the kind of image I get. And, sort of while laughing and making a joke about it, So Scandinavia has this like Viking heritage.
Yeah, and I know half the actors on the Vikings serious, by the way, but they're all sissies. Okay?
I can imagine.
It's just costumes.
My wife's a big fan, so we'll find out who's really cool. And people are in love with this idea of the Viking as the sort of rough, tough, unfiltered, masculine, chop your head off kind of thing. And then Scandinavia is the place that's least like that I've ever been.
All right, but it is partly, if you go to the north, and I'll tell you what. This is the first year in 30 years that I spent the entire winter in Scandinavia. I haven't seen a Swedish Christmas for 30 years. It was a shock, right? Okay, what am I going to do? Well, since I'm going to stay here, I'm not going to make it a habit. I might as well go north. So I've been up to Norrland, which is the very northern end of Sweden. It could be northern Norway as well. And I discovered that people there are very different from, say, Stockholm or southern Sweden. They're much rougher. They break the rules. They don't care about government regulations and things like that at all. They live in a much freer life in that sense. You can experience that in America, because when you come to Alaska, you discover that people in Alaska are not like the other Americans at all.
I mean, it's partly climate, isn't it? It's partly if you've got to shovel snow every day. But what happened to the Vikings? As a sort of religious scholar, what happened to these rough, tough people that became a sort of sophisticated Stockholm, overly clean, dare I say, slightly feminized people?
Well, the Vikings disappeared because of climate change.
Okay, tell me more.
We had a much warmer climate during the Iron Age in Europe than we do now. And certainly compared to what we had afterwards. We had a very cold period from the 14th century forward. So what then happened was the Vikings lost their power because people caught up with them technologically and built boats as strong and as fast as the Vikings had. And they also got lost because of their own internal conflicts. Essentially, the Vikings set up Russia. Russia has Viking origins, but the Vikings who went from Sweden and Finland, who went east and then colonized Russia and created the first Russian states, eventually became decoupled from the rest of Scandinavia. They were called Ruriks. And they ruled Russia for the first 400 years. Russia was its own nation. And eventually they took on the Mongols. And then, of course, they mixed up with the Mongols and the other Slavs in Russia and became Russians. But the same thing happened apparently with the Danish and the Norwegian Vikings. They went north and they went west and they went certainly south. They went all the way down to Sicily. They, of course, colonized Normandy. And if you come from Britain or the UK, then certainly you have a lot of mixed blood, mixed ancestry with the Scandinavians.
So Viking kings.
They were also dissolved in that sense, but the Vikings disappeared. Then there were periods when Denmark and Sweden were major powers in Europe, and Sweden had a golden period after Protestantism came along. So the first country in the world that took on Martin Luther and threw out the Pope. I told you Swedes have this inclination to change opinions very quickly and change them all at the same time when they do. So they switched instantly overnight from Catholicism to Protestantism, of course, took possession of all the rich monasteries and churches that the Catholic Church owned. The Swedish state was suddenly the most powerful in Europe, had tons of money, and did what? Went to war, conquered the entire Baltic Sea, most of Germany, and went to the 30 Years' War of Europe. So Sweden had another golden period. Then it sort of disseminated again and became smaller. And what we eventually ended up was the Scandinavian model of smaller nation states with close collaboration, but independent from one another. And I think this is the model that slowly Britain will go towards as well once you get rid of the idea that you're still an empire. Because it makes sense in a modern sense. It's like the Baltic countries. The most wonderful countries in the world to work in. The three of them, they're all small.
I like them a lot.
Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. But you can travel in between them. But, you know, at the end of the day, if you want to get something done, go to a country like Estonia, because there's only 1 million people there. You can get it done within 2 weeks and see change.
You can meet the right person, get it sorted. Listen, let's talk. I just want to change track slightly here. Let's talk a little bit about the body. Obviously, this is the Embodiment podcast, much as I find this interesting. Do you have a particular philosophical take on the body? Do you think any of the traditions that you've studied bring something new to that? Like, I'd love to hear your take on the body.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, to begin with, the mind is completely embodied. This is one of the reasons I'm a philosopher of technology, and I've been fighting these nerds in Silicon Valley for the past 30 years because they're all Platonists. Like, they talk about uploading and ridiculous ideas like that. You cannot upload a mind, for God's sake. It's more than zeros and ones. You know, you get horny, you crack a joke, things like that. The computers will never be able to do. You just got to face reality here, and that is that human beings are not just logos. They're not just zeros and ones. Human beings are also pathos. We have intense emotions, feelings, and things going on. And these are not reducible to zeros and ones. And this means that the mind is embodied in itself. It cannot operate without a body. But I would also like to talk about the body, the human body, as a minded. It's just that our body is unique in the sense that it's not like other bodies are. There are certainly other animals that are also very intelligent, and many of them are social, and we love them for it. But when it comes to human beings, because of language, the fact that we can speak to each other, we can also write to each other, we can even print and send shit to each other, we do these days, or we can go interactive, do now, you and I, and use all the different forms of language at the same time. This increasingly makes human beings very complex. And what I'm interested in is to see the mind as truly embodied, which is why I love your work, Mark. But I also like to think of the idea, what if we extend the concept of embodiment, because we are extending ourselves by using new forms of language all the time. And these are the most dramatic shifts in human history we've seen. The fact that we speak, the fact that we print, write, the fact that we print, and the fact that we eventually also went interactive are the 4 major revolutions of mankind. And I think the last one is the one we're in the middle of right now, to understand what interactivity really is.
Say those 4 again. I just want to slow you down a bit because this bears chewing on. Say the 4 again.
First, we speak. I usually crack the joke that I know a drunk guy in a bar on a Friday night, it's hard to tell whether he's an ape or a human. But if he actually says to the girl that he wants to take her home and fuck her, then he's probably a human. He's a bloke, right? So we speak. We're humans. then we've done that for at least the last 200,000 years in a meaningful way, in a structured way, meaning it's powerful. And on top of that, we started writing some 8,000 years ago and developed civilization because of it.
Right? Because then ideas can be written down, they can be passed on. There's a
we could permanently settle. There's no way you can create a culture of permanent settlement without written language. Because it requires a certain amount of complexity. And as long as you have to memorize everything in your head, you cannot create a society as complex as a permanent settlement.
I think some embodiment people don't give language its due, because we're all about like, hey, it's about feeling, it's not about language. You go to yoga, you don't talk. You go to meditation, you don't talk. But actually, we are linguistic creatures. And
oh yeah, then we're not embodied, because I always argue that if you try to separate body and keep it superior to mind, then you make the same mistake, just the reversed version of it. And I'm against all these reductionisms that try to turn a human being into only a mind or only a body. I'm aggressively against both. I think actually to be able to separate body and mind and then unite them again is what is fundamentally human. For men, at least, and to be able to separate war and hunting are the next step. And only the third one is a separation of masculine and feminine.
Okay, we'll come to masculine and feminine, but let's complete on this list then. So we're linguistic, we speak, we then write, which is kind of a revolution and has profound implications. What are the next two?
And of course, then we develop writing techniques and new alphabets and things. And every time we do that, it turns out there's a revolution that just happened, right? So after written language, the next major revolution in history is the printing press. And it was developed first in China, but they didn't know how to use it properly to their advantage. So it was later in Europe with cheap paper and other things that were also necessary. Starting in 1450 in southern Germany, the printing press revolutionized the world. And this is the brief period of history when Europe came to the center of the planet.
Right, because instead of having to spend months writing a book, copying it by hand, you could spend a matter of hours, you could mass produce books. So knowledge could be spread at a scale which wasn't even possible before.
Yeah. So if you produced a single copy of a book in 1449, it took you 2 years on average to make one copy of a book. And the average cost to make that book would be something like £150,000 per book.
Like if you owned 100
and 100 years later, it costs you 30 cents to make a book and it takes a minute. Then you can start to understand what an enormous revolution it was that we started printing books. And we could basically teach every person in a society to learn how to read and write and count. And this, of course, was the prerequisite for capitalism, for the industrial age, for nationalism. All those things that we developed over the last 100 years, starting in Europe and then spreading around the globe, all came out of the printing press revolution.
And the fourth one?
The fourth one is the one we started living in since the 1980s. It's the internet revolution, because the interactive language is so radically different from printed language. To begin with, we basically put a megaphone into the mouth of every human being.
I'm still trying to get my head around this, right? Like I can send an email to 400,000 people on this phone now. I have all the music of humanity here. Mozart, the Beatles, everything. Today I communicated with people live on Zoom in 10 different countries already today. I'm interviewing you in Sweden. I have WhatsApp groups with people, dozens of people in dozens of countries. I'm looking up any information I can. Like I went to a 12-step meeting last night and it was on the internet and there was 35 people there who had all found it through the internet. But I'm the scale of, I can put this podcast will be listened to by thousands of people in 100 different countries. I mean, that's very different than sort of getting on a camel and going on the Silk Road and spending 6 months or 2 years to get to China. You know what I mean? Like this is getting to China instantly. And there's a spreadability and a viralness, a scale and a speed. And my biggest problem is which of the 200 books that I've downloaded to my phone do I listen to today? It's not that it's not that I have to.
Which one of the Netflix series are you going to watch? There are now hundreds or thousands of them. The amount of cultural output is exploding. And the two things to keep in mind here, a lot of it is junk.
Right.
And out of the 18 million songs or so on Spotify, actually 5 million are never heard by anybody.
Right. This is curve, the long.
This is like the junk bottom of it. And then there's a curve to that which is consumed. And, but I would say it also means you kill the talk, because we used to live in a very centralized world. You'd have a capital, politics would be a central organization, academia would be centrally organized, so knowledge would be centrally organized, a mass media would be like a few newspapers would print the truth, and this is how things are actually operating, and they would pretend they'd be a little different opinions in between them, but basically they had the same ideology too. So we lived in a very centralized world after the printing press. And what scares the shit out of us with interactivity is that we now live in a completely decentralized world. There are a lot of Mark Walshes out there who find a subcultural tribal audience of a few hundred or thousands people who follow what they do. And they tend, like you do, to interact with that community. That is the future. But it's very tribal. It's based on what we call digital subcultures, subcultural. Yes. And that's where you find your new home in this new world. And it can be global. I'll give you an example. I had COVID-19 early on. I was really sick in March and April. And I went to see a doctor, just to get on the medical care. My doctor sent me home and said, listen, you're bright and smart. Why don't you go online? That will be much more helpful to you than to talk to me.
Wow.
And within a couple of days, I networked with thousands of men of my own age group and discovered they were not dying, but they got a really bad version of the disease. Yeah. And we started helping each other. Like, what do you do if you have a fever in the morning? What do you do if you don't have a fever in the morning? What signs are you going to look out for? What is dangerous? When do you really have to go to the hospital? When can you actually maintain this at home on your own? And the sense of community that was just spontaneously created by men my own age who were online was fantastic. Unheard of before the internet. So these things are the great things with the internet. But the problem with the internet is that the narrative is completely fucked up because we're trying to keep the sort of old narratives of centralization going when in reality, everything operates towards decentralization. Even the big tech companies are trying to make us think in a centralized manner, and they're all going to fail. We're all leaving Facebook at the moment because we didn't want Facebook to dictate how we should live our lives. But they tried to. They even tried to make us addicted to it.
The YouTube algorithm, which is telling me what I should watch. And I was like, the whole point is that I don't want this dictated. Like,
no, if it was your algorithm, that would be fantastic. If it really was a free and open algorithm, the way Google search was 10 years ago, that was great. But when they started manipulating your algorithm through politics, when they started corrupting your algorithm with advertising, and when they started conforming your algorithms as well, that's when it got eerie. And that's exactly where YouTube is today. YouTube doesn't point me where I want to go. It points me where they want me to go.
Exactly.
I don't want that.
Saying, hey, don't you want to watch what the BBC says about COVID? No, I fucking don't. No, I didn't ask for that. No, that is not based on my search history. No, that's not based on my values. No, that's not based on anything other than a dictated agenda. And it's the same with Facebook. It's dictating like these politics to me. And I'm going, why have you given me this to watch?
They're all going to die. None of them understands the internet. Yeah. This is what I've been working on as a philosopher for the past 30 years. And I knew that we would have these huge companies that were highly successful, but they were built on the old centralization model. The last version of that was that all the data would be in the cloud. Well, hey, if Jeff Bezos owns the cloud, it's not you and me owning it, and he can turn off anything when he wants to. We don't want him as an emperor. We never elected Jeff Bezos. Out. We need to get out of that. I believe in a decentralized internet, and I think it's the only way forward, but we need new narratives. We need new stories about ourselves so we actually don't go off and kill our neighbors, which is what narratives were always about.
What are you, this killing our neighbors, divisiveness that seems to have happened in the internet age, this increasing polarity, tribalism in a kind of new way, echo chambers. What do you have to say about that? Because it seems like that's got to a point now. And I guess the other related thing is we have a crisis of trust. So my friends at Rebel Wisdom talk, there's a great YouTube channel I really enjoy. They talk about...
yeah, I know them well too, yes.
Yeah, the sort of crisis of meaning, the crisis of sense making, they call it. Like, who do we believe? Let's take an issue like COVID or an issue like, the American election. Because there's not a centralized narrative. Like in the past, everyone just believed the BBC and Channel 4 was of mine. ITV was a slight variation of that. It wasn't very different. Now, me and my wife were talking last night and we're saying, well, how's COVID in the UK? She's like, well, which news are you watching? And, she's sending me a news channel. There's another news channel. We don't know where to start with who to trust because it's decentralized.
Yeah, but my dad gave me 5 newspapers in the morning when I was 6 years old. As soon as I started reading, he gave me 5 newspapers every morning. He said, read 5, then make up your mind. And I think it's the only way to pursue truth. is actually to put different opinions against one another. And you need the entire spectrum. There would be a communist newspaper there, and there'd be one from the Pentecostal Christians.
Okay,
so that would be the extremes, right? But that's how I learned to pursue the truth, was that you got to go through the different against each other. So for example, the way it should work, or maybe does work with people who figure it out, is that we want the free and open algorithm, but we want it with a little twist. So you and I, for example, we trust the thousands of people who engage in this conversation with you and me right now more than we trust the BBC.
Yeah.
The very people that we are aligned with, the larger families, the larger sort of digital clans and tribes that we create today, are where we find trust, because we know that thousands of people will probably not be wrong, especially when they're engaged with the world and enthusiastic about being embodied and, pursue truth anyway. But on top of that, what we need is not the ad that we Google search. We need a little bottom that says antagony. It's a beautiful old Greek word that I use all the time, antagonia, meaning that what if you just got the opinion from the exact opposite of where you think you're going? What if you got the opinion that's the most uncomfortable opinion to hear? Because that would force you to rethink your position and either deepen it or actually just admit you were wrong. And that is what I think clever people are looking for today. I think the 2010s was all about the echo chambers.
Yeah.
And I think they're over. And I think anybody with their smart mind today do not want to stay in an environment where they get their own view emphasized and re-emphasized all the time. We are dying to find opinions that differs from ours, because otherwise we're stupid. And for kids, you can explain this to a 19-year-old in a couple of minutes and they get it. I said, if you want to be netocratic, as we call it, if you want to be highly successful in the future in the digital world, then go and find an opinion that's different from your own.
Yeah. Okay. So
look for it actively. And I think a good algorithm today would occasionally throw in that in your Spotify playlist to be the song you were not expected to like. So what do you think of this? That is being thrown in there to almost disturb you. And you eventually discover that a few of these things that are thrown in there as anomalies into your worldview are actually really good for you.
Yeah. Oh shit. I got into country music. I wasn't expecting that. Oh my God. Now I'm re-owning my family values, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I've had experiences like that for sure. And I think travel's good for that. Throwing things in the mix, also for me, there's something about being in multiple communities. So for example, I'm in the embodiment community, right? But I'm also in the science fiction community online. So I hear like people talking about Warhammer 40,000 is just stuff I'm never going to hear in the embodiment world. I'm also into the World War II military community. I'm into the addiction recovery community, who are very different than the normal yoga people.
And that's a fascinating community because it's very global, actually.
It's globalized, it's decentralized, it's anarchist.
We used that community, the addiction community. We used that for when we wrote the Synthesism book, because we understood that a lot of contemporary, really functional spirituality came out of that very scene. And it's by knowing people who indirectly were immersed in that scene that I got to know about it and got so fascinated. So there you go. Your subcultural belonging is a lot stronger and gets better if you also do not share subcultures with your friends. So if your friends know that you're their ambassador with a specific interest that they don't share, but they know a guy who has that interest, that even enhances the quality of the subcultural identity. And I think this is why antagony is absolute key. I'd say, if anything now is the difference between successful people and the people who will be not so successful online, the difference between an upper class and underclass in the digital realm eventually, if we start looking, say, 50 years forward, it would be that the people who actively look for the antagony are going to be the winners. And the people who just want to stay in their own comfort zone and have it reinforced all the time are now lost in what we call the echo chambers. I think this goes for anybody in the world today, American, Asian, European, doesn't matter. And in a way, when I converted to Zoroastrianism, a lot of my friends would ask me, so why did you go for an Eastern spiritual tradition and convert to it? And I'm just like, you know what? To be European and to pretend that I'm Christian and to say that philosophy started with the Greeks is so boring now and so dull and so echo chamberish that you can't even imagine that. No, I'd rather sit down with a Korean Catholic than sit down with an Italian Catholic, because anybody who has a sort of bicultural or tricultural or multicultural background are way more interesting to talk to than the people who are only proud of where they come from and stick with it all the times.
Yeah, and earlier you did talk about having pride in where you come from. I mean, how do countries survive this internet age? Do they? Or, is Sweden and England and the United States, are they things 50 years from now? Because you know, I'm walking down the street here, I meet someone who knows about the Embodiment Conference. We have more in common about that. You know, I'm a British person meeting an American in Mexico, and we end up having dinner talking about embodiment. Like donation, you know, people are working virtually. You know, it's almost a anomaly for you to be spending winter at home in Scandinavia, right? You haven't done it in 30 years. Like, can countries survive this sort of decentralization?
Do you want to know who's the winner? The city-states. Look at the world map. Places like Singapore and Dubai, Monaco.
Why?
They're doing well, aren't they? I worked in 2 countries in Europe. I've actually advised the governments. They're called Estonia and Slovenia. And the reason why I love these countries is they're beautiful, and people are clever and sharp, but they're also small. Meaning you can have an idea and you can have that idea implemented within weeks if it's a great idea and it gets popular. I think the old empires, the final empires, are not the European ones, because they did fall apart after 1945, thankfully. But I think America and I think China and Russia are really unstable, old style empires that we don't need any longer. And I always get asked this question by Americans: what is it that America needs? You know, we are so polarized. Well, you're not really listening to anybody else, are you, to begin with? It's just like America is only obsessed about America. It's like America's like your old uncle that got stuck up his own asshole, right? Right. But I say, you know, I think Brexit was a good thing for Europe. So the day an American state dares to leave the union and say, listen, we're going to go independent and try a different model, that would be really healthy for America. That is the best thing that could happen to America.
I was just in Miami. It has its own personality. It could easily be a city-state. Equally, a lot of people are moving around America now based on differences between states and lifestyle. So all the people that, you know, I met a Portland refugee who just got out of Portland because he was just like, it's got too woke for him.
I met several too.
And they were like in Florida or in Texas. So it's like people are moving according to values.
Yes, they are.
And then you'll get a polarization of values, and then you get like, actually, we don't want to be subjected to this law. Texas, for example, could be the first to succeed.
Yeah, and we just hope there's not going to be a civil war because of it, because I think the healthiest thing could happen in America is the states become more independent. Because the great thing with the union is that they are actually competing with one another for people's attention, which I think is a good thing. People can move. They can get up from somewhere, move somewhere else. That's the good thing with the European Union. You can actually move around in Europe these days. That's great. So if you don't get the values that you want and your Wi-Fi is too bad and you're not paid properly for your hard work, then you can just move somewhere else. I think migration is fantastic. The next book I'm writing is actually a big celebration of migration throughout history. And yes, but I think for America, they need more models than thinking that the United States is the only thing in the world. When in reality, the rest of the world are so tired now of Donald Trump. Can we please just have something else? You know? We've heard it now. We heard this. Yes, you did pick Cartman from South Park for president for 4 years for some strange reason. Okay, you did that. Yeah, these are the consequences. It could have gone really bad. Like, we were lucky. We got out. We got nothing worse than COVID-19. But, you know, let's do something different this time. Maybe something that doesn't come from America next time, like listen to other people.
I mean, just having a British person talk to a Swede, I mean, our audience is 50% American, and they just won't hear that very often. You know, the average embodiment conference is 90% Americans, even if they're different colored skins and half of them are women, you know, like they're still 90% American. So even just to hear someone talk about a Scandinavian or Brexit, you know, that they might hear a Brit, but even a Scandinavian is pretty rare, let alone a Turk or a Russian or a Saudi. Like, that's just not part of the embodiment narrative. But you said immigration then. So, you know, Scandinavia has been radically changed by immigration in my lifetime.
Especially Sweden. Yeah,
especially Sweden. I was really surprised when I went to Sweden. Less so maybe Norway, and maybe Denmark in the middle, I guess. You know, I'm now in Mexico. I'm a digital nomad. It makes me puke a bit to think about it, but I am. You know, you've spent all the last winters abroad, so we've sort of seen both sides. It's, you know, from an immigrant family. So, I mean, how does this moving, I mean, people have always moved around, right? Like the Silk Road and whatever, Romans, you know, but this is a new level of moving around.
Yeah, I mean, we were migrating all the time. We were nomads originally. So we were practicing nomadology. The original religion is that everything returns to the same. It's all the same because we're walking all the time. We have to be on the move to survive. Then we started permanently settled some 8,000 years ago. And eventually that became a model. That became the pervasive model around the world. But we're back to nomadic life again. But this time around, we're voluntarily choosing it. And we call it global nomadism. I think John Sedgwick and I actually came up with the term the global nomad in the late 1990s, and it sort of stuck.
Yeah,
you and I are both global nomads, right? But it's now the sort of digitally savvy upper classes that are moving all the time. And it's ironically enough, the people that are left behind that seem to get stuck in a place and want to defend it all times, you know, the somewheres and the anywheres and the everywhere.
And the rich. So think about it. It's the guy in Afghanistan who wants a better life, so he comes to London to get a job, right? Yeah. It's the very poor, and it's the middle class digital nomads. It's the people in the middle who just have a normal job in the supermarket who don't move, right? Like the very poor are moving around the world like never before. Like levels of immigration from the UK from, you know, very poor countries are huge, as, you know, Sweden, war refugees, Syrians, you know, people that have had very hard lives, as are the Swedes who are moving out of Sweden to go live in Thailand to work on the internet. But it's the sort of middle that stays put at the moment.
Yes, it is. The terms used for that are anywheres and somewheres and everywheres. You know, you hear about anywheres and somewheres, and there's a conflict between. I would say there's also a category like you and I that I call the everywheres, where it's just like, I don't care really if you're in Sweden or Mexico, but it's kind of fun just to pay attention to that detail. But for our conversation, it doesn't matter at all.
No, I could be doing this podcast from Miami or the Caribbean or England, which is or Turkey. There's in the last 2 months, I've been in those 5 countries.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm just, as long as it's Wi-Fi, I'm fine. You know, like that's interestingly, when I talk to my PA organizes my travel. And one of the first questions I ask is, how's the Wi-Fi? Because like, that's actually the most important thing. It's not whether there's a washing machine here, because I can get the laundry done. It's not, you know, it's not how close it is to restaurants, because I know there'll be food somewhere.
And the second question is electricity plug standards. You know, you can plug in your machines or not.
So don't worry about that. But I've got those international ones that does all sort of the 4 major ones. So it's funny, that's become my primary question is how's the Wi-Fi? You know, we even have deals where we say to the Airbnb, if the Wi-Fi is not good, I want a full refund by the first day, because I have to then find another accommodation. That's the only thing we do that on. And I think that's indicative, you know. But and it's the first question everyone who works in a cafe gets asked now. You know, when you go into a cafe or a bar, you go, hey, can I have a soda water? And then they almost give you the card that has the Wi-Fi code on. They're like rolling their eyes because they've been asked that question so many times.
Yeah, you know? Just get rid of the password. It saves you a lot of time.
It saves the poor guy who works in the cafe a lot of trouble. Okay, we have to talk about sex and gender. So before we finish here, you know, you've said a lot about this. I know you've been controversial around this. I just read that you were a sex worker at one point, or at least in part, in Amsterdam. Like, how does everything you're saying relate to sex and gender?
Oh, okay. As a philosopher, I work with something that's called archetypology. And archetypology is way more important to us than psychology is. People go to see a psychotherapist, but you're all being treated the same, which I think is a terrible mistake. Human beings are very different from one another. Gender is just one of the differences. There are so many different types of men and women and everything in between. It's unbelievable. And instead of looking at the richness of that and start from there, we have these standards. And they've gone up completely absurd, because it's either you're a man or a woman, and then you're a man or woman through decision, and then you're a woman because you're born that way. You can't do anything about it. This has gone completely absurd, because we can't deal with archetypes. We can't deal with difference between one another. And we have to go back to that. So we're working with something we call tribal mapping. And this is how we've done it. We worked on it for 20 years. It's deep anthropology. So we go to Canada and live with the Inuits. We go to Brazil and live with the Shikibos in the jungle. We go to New Guinea. But we also go to urban populations, say in China or France. And we certainly check data online, how people live, to compare different populations. And what we've done in this work is that we discovered we see the same map everywhere, because all these people were the same. All humans were the same until at least maximum 30,000 years ago. And our genetic makeup was shaped through tribal life for at least 70,000 years. That's where we all come from. That is the origin of humanity. So we call this archetypology. And then we look at the archetypes, and we also look at the map of how people organize themselves, for example, professionally, like over the day, and how you support one another, because all human beings deeply want to contribute. They want to be contributive to their community. That's a fundamental human thing. And if you don't get to contribute to your community, you go and kill yourself. That's why I'm against things like universal basic income, because they destroy the connection between reward and contribution. And I think they're very dangerous to play around with. So when you look at the map, you discover that every community will look at as a very strong matriarchy at the center. This is the community ruled by the older women. This is the basis for reproduction. This is where children are born. This is the heritage. The day you die, it's all about the matriarchy, all about the inner circuit, as we call it. So that's the foundation. On top of that, we have an outer circuit called the patriarchy, where most men are located. And this is where the warfare and the hunting goes on. That's where you're dragging the proteins into the community, is the way I said, rather than the vitamins, right? So we discover these patterns in Arctic climatic zones. We discover them in the tropics. So these are constantly a successful formula for organizing human life. Then in between these, I'm a strong defender of LGBTQ people, because in between these two categories, you have the go-betweens between men and women, essentially, or between patriarchy and matriarchy, and they're called androgynous. So we call them the androgynous characters in our work, and like Camille Paglia, I'm a strong defender of them, but I don't think they should be models for any of the other two categories. They should be proudly their own category and celebrate. I'm all for a third gender. I think India made a wise decision to allow a third gender into their passports and into their bureaucracy, everything, because actually in tribal life, that makes sense. There is a third gender there. But then you also have the go-betweens between communities. We're not at constant warfare with the outside world. And those are the shamanic characters. We call them shamanoid people. And we showed in our work that about 4% of the population are androgynous, about 4% of the population are shamanoid, and about 92% of men and women are just regular men and women.
Right.
Now, once I present this theory to people, and they get the whole idea of the archetypology, they get, yeah, wonderful. I can finally put myself on the social map and now understand why I have the talents that I have and why I'm proud of my profession. It is fantastic. It's so liberating for people to be able to see this map and put themselves on the map, and then explore what it means to be, for example, a man or being a woman. And I think what I've been very involved in the last 5 years is to build the men's movement in Europe, but I'm also supporting a whole new women's movement at the same time, but I don't want to interfere with it. They should not have my opinion about what they do. They should find out for themselves what it means to be a woman. But we call the entire movement a desexualized spaces movement, because we now live in environments where men and women are forced to be together all the time, every day.
Yeah.
And it creates all kinds of problems that we haven't foreseen. We didn't expect that men and women would go crazy being together all the time because we were romantically told that that's what we wanted. But in reality, actually, men and women in most cultures get together at night. And then they enjoy each other's companies. And then their sexuality works. And then it's great for the kids the next morning. But actually, in most cultures, men and women live very different lives during the daytime. And I think we need to redefine that or rediscover that and see it as an asset and not as a problem.
It's interesting what you've said could be framed as being really super hyper modern and super considerate to different groups of people. But I bet you get misunderstood a lot with that.
Yeah, but you and I are against secularization. You and I are very much that religion was there all along. And instead of having bad religion that we're not conscious of, maybe we should have religion we are conscious of, that it's a good religion.
Yes.
We're pro-spirituality, right? I don't think you can talk about men or women or transgender people without speaking about religion and spirituality. I think gender is a deeply spiritual thing. And I am proud of the kind of man that I am. It took me archetypology to discover where I can serve the community best. I'm really proud of it. But it also means that I can deeply respect and admire men who are different from me. And I think this is so essential for understanding other cultures, is that I don't have to be like them. I don't have to agree with them, but I can admire them, that they're different from me.
We do need to wrap up really soon. I'm curious, like some people said, I even shouldn't speak to you because you were too dangerous or too controversial. You know, like literally they said, don't speak to that guy. And I couldn't find anything that seemed that bad. You're clearly not some kind of Nazi or something. So I was kind of like, I don't get why I was told that by a couple of people.
I think it's because I often use a rough language, but I do it on purpose, because I think that anybody who says, don't talk to that guy, and they have no argument for it. The only thing they can say is that his tonality is wrong, his etiquette is wrong, all that. I hate that. So I much rather be sort of a working class bloke who has a rough language and uses all the wrong words on purpose and to provoke people, then I would be this guy who plays with the game that tonality and etiquette are actually okay. Because I think the people who are obsessed with tonality and etiquette are very superficial.
That's interesting.
They don't go to the depth of what it means to be human at all.
That's why I piss a lot of people off. It's sometimes more about the tonality than what I'm saying. It's like,
but watch out for that, because when you should call people out, It's precisely when they fall into the trap of accusing you of using the wrong tone or not being able to follow the right etiquette. And especially with the UK, I love England. I worked there for 30 years in the music industry, but England is a country that's obsessed with social coding. And a lot of English people don't realize how tiresome that can be for a foreigner when you talk to English.
I get what you're saying. The American kind of political scene is also more about etiquette and social coding.
Oh, and so is the Scandinavian scene too. So this whole social justice warrior thing has been a lot about tonality and etiquette, but it hasn't been about the profound changes that we really need in society.
Yeah, it's a form of middle class oppression as well.
Yes, of course it is. Yeah,
it's like you didn't go to the right finishing school. Anyway, listen, we need to wrap up. So where do people find you on the internet? Your books, just like briefly, where's the place to go to find your stuff?
Okay, you can find Alexander Bard's books on Amazon if you're interested. Synthesism and Digital Libido are the last two, and we're working on our sixth book at the moment. And I'm also a member of the Intellectual Deep Web, which is how I know the Rebel Wisdom guys and how I found about you, Mark.
Okay.
So there are so many different great networks for people interested in art and philosophy and things online today. Intellectual Deep Web is one you can check out and apply to. But I love being part of those networks. I love art. I love philosophy. I love political and spiritual activism. That's what I'm into.
Personal website?
No, I don't have one. No, I got tired of selling myself, to be honest. Okay. I'm a terrible salesperson. So
I found you on Wikipedia. I was like, okay, cool. He's got a Wikipedia.
But you can Google my name and you can find tons of stuff that I've done on YouTube. And like a lot of people during the Corona year, I did a lot of webcasts and podcasts. So besides this wonderful conversation with Mark, I have a lot of conversations up, and your algorithm probably points you to the one that you'd be most interested in.
I love that you trust the algorithm. And last question.
And I'm on Twitter, so you can find me on Twitter. Yeah.
What the fuck do I call this episode? I mean, that sums up you in a way. It's like, what do we possibly call this episode?
How about reversed embodiment? Because we talked a lot about enmindment today.
Enmindment?
Yeah.
Okay. How would you enmindment? I'm going to call it that.
We can call it embodiment in reversal and beyond. Because we actually twist embodiment back and forth, aren't we?
Reversed embodiment. We're going to call it that. But I think that says something about you that's hard to sum up. Listen, I'm very proud and happy to be in contact with you. So let's talk again. Love to Maria, who I think put us in contact originally.
Yes. Same to you. And I'd love to hang out in Mexico, Bali, or whatever next winter we have a house together.
Next winter. See you there, man. I've got to run. Take care.
Yes. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.